actions, Jordan says, are only the beginning. In the meantime, back in Washington, President Obama appeared at the National Prayer Breakfast with what he apparently thought was an important message in the wake of this pilot's execution: to advise Americans that hundreds of years ago, Christians killed in the name of religion too.
Unless we get on our high horse and think this is unique to some other place, remember that during the Crusades and the Inquisition, people committed terrible deeds in the name of Christ. In our home country, slavery and Jim Crow all too often was justified in the name of Christ. It is not unique to one group or one religion. There is a tendency in us, a sinful tendency that can pervert and distort our faith.
Chief White House correspondent Ed Henry is live for us tonight at the White House. Ed?
Megyn, his aides say this was merely the president adding a little historical context as he slipped into what really sounded like preacher mode, or maybe it was law professor mode. As his critics say, he was really just trying to downplay the current struggles with Islamic militants, because he was pointing out acts that date back to the Middle Ages. And they say the president was downplaying what's happening now, as his aide Susan Rice gives a major speech tomorrow laying out the president's national security strategy. Remember, when they laid out the strategy 5 years ago in a similar speech, they downplayed counterterrorism, said there had to be a lot of other focuses, that we had to get out of a war footing. And that's why I pressed Josh Earnest today saying, do they have any regrets about what they said 5 years ago about downplaying counterterrorism? Listen.
You had to focus on managing threats, use less American power, and not just focus on counterterrorism. In retrospect, was that naive 5 years later?
No, I think that not at all. In fact, I think one clear piece of evidence to indicate that strategy has enjoyed some success is the success that the administration has had and that the president has had in building and leading a coalition of more than 60 nations to take the fight to ISIL.
Now, at the prayer breakfast, the president also called ISIS a brutal, vicious death cult. Very tough words, but Republican Lindsey Graham said he needs to go beyond that with tough action. Graham saying that right now the president is on the sidelines while Islamic militants run wild, in his words, throughout the Mideast. Megyn?
Ed Henry, thank you. Joining us now with more, Mark Thiessen. He's a former chief speechwriter to President George W. Bush, an American Enterprise Institute fellow, and a Fox News contributor. And so, Mark, you know better than most that the words a president chooses at an event like this matter, and they're carefully thought through. And the president, 48 hours after we saw that Jordanian man burned alive, for some reason thought it was important to remind the world about the evils that Christians committed 1,000 years ago.
Yeah, it's inexplicable to me. You're right, words matter, and the president thinks these things through, so this is revealing as to his worldview. And 48 hours after seeing that video, his reaction is to say, we have to get off of our high horse because Christians have committed terrible deeds in the name of Christ. What does he mean by get off our high horse? And what kind of person looks at a video of a man being burned alive, and his reaction is to say, well, let's not forget, we in the West did that too. I mean, with all due respect, the Crusades were almost started 1,000 years ago. The Inquisition was in the 15th century. ISIS is burning people alive today, now, not Christians. Islamic radicals are doing this. And he won't call them, still in this speech, won't call them by name.
He's being accused by his critics of drawing some sort of moral equivalence between, Christians and radical Islamists. But as awful as the deeds that were done 1,000 years ago were, is there any point in drawing our attention to them?
Well, first of all, it's fascinating that he said people committed terrible deeds in the name of Christ. Has he ever said ISIS has committed terrible deeds in the name of Muhammad or in the name of Islam? No, in his speech today, Ed Henry mentioned that he said it was a death cult. He said they kill in the name of religion. He won't call it Islamic radicalism, which is a problem. And second of all, what he's basically saying, who launched the Crusades? The Catholic Church. So he's basically saying the Catholic Church was the Al-Qaeda of its day. I mean, I'd like to see him explain that to Pope Francis when he comes to Washington.
Well, and then to bring slavery and Jim Crow into it as well, as though, you know, that is somehow morally the equivalent of what we're watching today with ISIS.
But also, it was evangelical Christians who fought slavery and Jim Crow. It was William Wilberforce who led the campaign against slavery, who was a Christian leader. It was Martin Luther King. It was evangelical Christians who fought those things. So to draw that analogy is wrong. And then the other thing, quite frankly, is we need to remember that for the President of the United States to invoke the Crusades and the deeds that were done in the name of the Crusades, we have to remember that plays right into Islamist propaganda. They call us the Crusaders. Osama bin Laden, when he issued his fatwa declaring war on the United States, called for jihad against Jews and Crusaders. The leader of ISIS calls our campaign against ISIS the Crusader campaign. So when the President of the United States steps up in front of the cameras and has film of him talking about the terrible deeds that were done in the name of Christ during the Crusades, that is a propaganda gold mine for our enemies.
He seems determined, Mark, to bend over backwards to make sure that Muslims in America, and elsewhere for that matter, don't think that we are condemning all of Islam. You know, that every religion has, you know, marks on its history, including Christians, Christianity, Catholics, and so on. And so, you know, in the same way that doesn't make Christians bad today, it doesn't make all Muslims bad today. That seems to be what he's driving at.
Yeah, and George W. Bush did the same thing, by the way. But he didn't shy away from calling it Islamofascism or Islamic radicalism and naming the ideology. Of course, no one blames all Muslims for what's being done in their name by a group of radical Islamists. There's a difference between radical Islamists and the peaceful followers of Islam, who are the majority of people in the world. But also, Islam needs its own William Wilberforce. It needs Islamic leaders to step up and say, this is un-Islamic. Just as Wilberforce said slavery was un-Christian.